Hello everybody and welcome to another video in the Simplified Opening series. In this video I would like to show you one relatively recent development in the Ruy Lopez, the variation with an early knight g7, which I think perfectly fits the Simplified Openings core idea, in a sense that only has three critical lines that white can try against this setup. It's curious that this setup has been used on more than one occasion by the Indian prodigies like Pragnananda and Gukesh, and also it has been used by Grischuk and Caruana, among others. Now, this line is actually a very practical way to play the Ruy Lopez with the black because it arises quite quickly. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, the move knight g7 is the move that we are going to explore in this video. It's curious that this move has been known for a very long time, obviously, and I have played it even myself more than 10 years ago. But back then, this move was associated with the plan of going g6 and bishop g7, in addition to d6, b5, and d4, taking on d4, and obtaining some sort of active play in the center. However, the latest developments with the move knight g7 are connected with a different plan. And that plan actually is more centrally oriented, as you shall see, and it comprises of playing the move knight g6 and pushing d5 whenever appropriate. As I said, there are only three critical lines that white can try against this line by black, and two of them arise after the move c3, and one of them arises after the move short castle. Now, before embarking on those, let's check a few lesser lines that, even though have been played by strong players, are not really critical. So one of those moves is the move knight c3. Yeah, it's a logical developing move, but it doesn't pose too much pressure. So d6, short castle, and bishop d7. And then black will continue with knight g6, bishop e7, short castle, maybe b5 at some point with a normal Ruy Lopez position. And if white remains passive in the center, black can even start thinking of active counterplay with f5 on the king side. Now this is one move that shouldn't really worry black. Another move is the move d4. Even though this has been played by Nepomniachtchi against Gukesh at the Toronto candidates, the line is really harmless, and Gukesh obtained very easy play and equality with natural moves. So e takes d4, obviously it's natural to recapture, knight d4, queen d4, knight c6. Now the other knight replaces the knight on c6 and targets the queen. Queen e3, the queen remains in touch with the c5 square in order to prevent the development of the bishop with bishop c5. And now bishop e7 as played by Gukesh. You can also emulate Grischuk if you want and go b5, bishop b3, bishop d6, which is also perfectly fine. Short castle, bishop b7, good development for black and no problems whatsoever. This was played in the online game Shirov Grischuk, played this year 2024. But let's continue with along the high-level game played at the candidates. Bishop e7, knight c3, short castle, knight d5. It appears that white is getting something because he goes after the bishop pair, but the idea of black is that after b5, bishop b3, knight a5, black will make sure that white does not remain with the bishop pair, because at any point he can exchange the knight on a5 for the bishop on b3. Queen g3 played by Nepomniachtchi, attacking the pawn on c7, bishop d6, attacking the queen and defending the pawn, bishop f4, queen f4, still the pawn on c7 is hanging, so now it's just simply d6, short castle, bishop e6, rook fd1, rook e8, and this was obviously very equal, and black did not have problems in this game, which was drawn in 40 moves. So a simple, straightforward play by black, showing that d4 cannot really be a serious move for white when considering fighting for an advantage. Now we check these, let's say, sidelines. Let's now go to the more critical lines. As I mentioned, one of the critical lines arises after the move short castle, and now knight g6. Yeah, and now playing the move c3. d4 again is possible, but again rather harmless. There is only one small detail that black needs to remember. So d4, e4, knight d4, knight d4, queen d4, b5, bishop b3, bishop b7, all natural so far. The idea that now after bishop b7 is to control the d5 square, so the threat is to go c5, attack the queen, and c4 trap the bishop. So rook d1 is a prophylactic move, the idea being that if now c5, then there is a very strong move bishop f7 check, king f7, queen d7. Yeah, and if the queens are exchanged, then there is a double attack check and white regains the piece. Yeah, and if queen e7, bishop g5 is similarly pretty bad for black. So black shouldn't rush with c5, and this is the moment where black should remember this detail, how to obtain very good play. And this detail is a rather peculiar queen maneuver, starting with queen e7, intending queen d6. So black is seeking an exchange of queens. So c4, the idea is to have the rook defended, but also put some pressure on the queen side, but this is harmless, queen d6. And if white avoids the exchange by queen e3, there is queen e5, intending already bishop d6 and or bishop c5. Yeah, and black already has very good play. And after queen d6, bishop d6, the end game is perfectly fine and equal. Knight c3, bc4, bishop c4, f6. This was played very recently in the game Fressinet Cornet at the French Championship this year. This line was tested in more than one game in that match, and black was confident in all of them, not losing a single one. So, and obtaining good position in all these games. So d4 again is harmless. The move to play is c3, and now we see one of the ideas of that knight getting to g6, which is, oops, that's too long arrow, defending the pawn on e5 and allowing for the move d5. So d5 is possible because the knight from c6 is pinned and no longer defends the pawn on e5, but the knight on g6 takes over the task, and d5 is possible. Now if white wants to achieve something, he must take on d5. The alternatives are just much weaker. d4, for example, just leads to a problem-free endgame. d takes e4, knight e5, knight g5, d5, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop d7, and black is absolutely problem-free. The pawn on e5 is hanging, short castle can happen, and black even won from this position in the game Lebedev-Grishchuk played online. Another passive move is the move d3, which obviously says that white cannot hope for an advantage because black achieved d5, which in the Lopez is not so easy to achieve, and has very comfortable development behind this pawn center. So bishop e7, rook e1, castles, knight bd2, bishop e6. Yeah, and obviously this is fine for black. After knight f1, Grishchuk played two different plans against Davidson. In an online game, he preferred the more complex king h8, knight g3, f6. Yeah, just keeping more tension in the center. Whereas against Kasimdzhanov, he preferred to just equalize without issues with b5, bishop b3, and knight a5. Now the idea is c5 and expand on the queen side, so white must take on d5, bishop d5, bishop d5, e d5, queen d5, knight e3, queen d7, d4, e4, knight d4, rook a d8. Obviously no problems whatsoever for black, and the game was drawn. Kasimdzhanov, Grishchuk played in Tashkent this year. So d4 not good, d3 not good. The only move is e d5, queen d5, and now there is this positional threat of queen d3. For example, if white forces it with bishop b3, queen d3, black obtains good play because he's already threatening something like bishop g4, long castle, e4, and white can end up in trouble. There is a small trick here that if white gets greedy, he actually gets into a trap. Knight g5 may appear strong, attacking the pawn on f7, but what transpires is that after bishop e7 attacking the knight, knight f7 and rook f8, the knight is trapped. So after queen d3, white should change gears, go bishop c2, and after queen d6, start to go for the d4 break, because otherwise he may end up worse. So rook e1, bishop e6, blocking the e file and intending long castle. So d4, bishop e7, and now after the exchanges of the central pawns, the position will be equal. Let's say bishop e3, e4, knight d4, knight d4, bishop d4, short castle. And black didn't have problems in the game Abdusatorov Pragnananda played in Prague this year, a game which in fact black won from this position. So again, it's quite visually obvious that this is harmless. So after queen d5, d4 is more active, but here the key move is bishop g4, and again black is absolutely problem free. I can try two moves here. One is to take the pawn on e5, d takes e5, long castle, queen takes d5, rook takes d5, and now black threatens to take on f3 and take on e5 to wreck white structure. And in fact, there is quite strong counterplay here for and compensation for the pawn in various lines for black. Let's check bishop b3, take on f3, gf3, rook e5, bishop f7, and now bishop d6. And already things are problematic. There is a threat of rook h5 attacking h2. There is a threat of rook f8 attacking the bishop and also attacking f3. And black has very good compensation. This was played in the game Gormali Sadvani played online in 2022, a game that black won. Alternative is after rook d5 is to take on c6, bc6, and knight bd2. And now if black wants really to make it simple, just take on f3, knight f3, knight e5, dead equality. Don't take on f3 on e5 immediately, knight e5, because c4 is a problem, as the rook is short of squares to defend the knight on e5. Or if you want to seek more and play for more than just equality, knight f4 is the move to play, threatening moves like knight e2 or knight d3, rook e1, knight d3, rook e2, and now more than one move. The engine suggests bishop h5, avoiding h3 attacks and intending to continue with f6. And when the pawn is removed from e5, the bishop can be developed to d6. So the pair of bishops and the very active position of black's pieces mean that he has very good compensation for the pawn. So that's one line after d4, bishop g4. The other one is bishop b3. But this again leads to an endgame after bishop takes f3, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d1, rook d1, long castle, and again a problem-free endgame for black. Bishop takes f7 and e takes d4. So material is equal, and black's active pieces again compensate for the bishop pair. So let's say cd4, knight d4. The knight on d4 is not weaker than any of white's bishops. Again, a game played by Sadvani, this time over the board. Wieczorek Sadvani played in Spilimbergo 2021, won by black from this equal endgame. So this is one of the critical lines that I mentioned, one of the three, which is short castle, knight g6, c3, d5. But as you could see, well, I also was a bit surprised that this was so problem-free for black, but I still decided to call this a critical line because it's critical in the sense that white plays for some central advance, let's say first castle and then intending c3 and d4. But as we see, black is actually faster with d5 and white doesn't get his central play. Well, that means that a bit more critical than short castle is the move c3. And after the move knight g6 that we are going to check, white plays d4. Before going knight g6, I just want to mention one line which is too, how to call it, obscure and aesthetically weird for my taste, but it seems to work in practice, and if you feel attracted to it, feel free to explore it. And that starts with the move f6. Just awful, I know, but d4, d5 seems to be working for white, seems to be working for black. So if you feel like it, explore this, and it can be a good surprise weapon, especially if white just sees f6 and goes, what? d4, d5, how is this not losing with just weakening of the light squares, blah blah, but in fact black is fine. So check this. I'm not gonna go in this direction, sorry about that. what to do. I'm more classically educated. Yeah. So knight g6. Let's go for the center. Yeah. Now obviously d4, short castle d5 transposes to the lines we just saw after short castle. So d4 is the critical move, but it's worth mentioning perhaps the move h4, yeah, which is the standard move to harass a knight on g6. And here black can play in more than one way. d5 is one, h5 is another, but I think bishop e7 is the best. Just ignoring the pawn and attacking it, yeah, and developing. The point is that now if g3, d5 is fine, yeah, or if d4, then just take the pawn on h4. And in case of h5, knight f4. So there is a threat to knight g2, and there is also a threat knight d3. Yeah, so let's say short castle, knight d3. Yeah, and in case of d4, just take the pawn, knight g2, king f1, knight h4. And after d5, knight f3, queen f3, knight a5. White may have some compensation, but black is perfectly fine. After b5, the knight will join the game via c4. d6 will happen, black is solid, good development, extra pawn. Well, why not just play on from that position? Interesting move h4, perhaps worth exploring more from white's perspective, as the main lines, as we will see, give black really good play. So d4 by white, ed4, and now cd4. Taking with the knight is, well, possible obviously, but not very critical, because after bishop c5, bishop e3, knight c5, the idea is, okay, now knight c6 is a threat as the bishop is not defended on c5, so knight c5. The position resembles some lines in the Scotch, the lines with bishop c5, but I would say in a better version for black, because that bishop on a4 is a bit off, and black's knight is already on g6. Normally in that line, black goes queen f6 and the knight goes to e7 and maybe then goes to g6, but here already is on g6, so there is no need to play with the queen that early on. And play also is very simple here for black. Let's say queen e2, short castle, and then d6, b5, yeah, maybe knight c4, bishop b7, and so forth. For example, let's say f4, b5, counter-attacking, bishop c2, knight c4, attacking the bishop, attacking b2, and d6 comes next. Black has good development, very good central control, and obviously good play. So that's knight takes d4. cd4 is obviously the standard move, obtaining the full center, and bishop b4 check. And now we come to the final two critical lines that I mentioned, and they are bishop d2 and knight c3. So how does black counter against both? Let's start with knight c3, d5. Black counters in the center thanks to the pin on the knight, and there's one point that's worth remembering, and it comes with the about the move orders here a little bit. So with the knight being pinned and the e4 pawn under attack, white should decide between short castle and ed5. Worth noting that e5 is harmless, because after bishop g4 there is already a threat of knight h4, targeting that pinned knight on f3, and after just something like short castle f6, black has excellent play. So e5 is not really an option. Yeah, it's either ed5 or short castle, but against both, black has good game. It's just worth remembering the subtleties of the move order. So let's start with ed5. Now, it may appear that black can just take on d5, but this is imprecise, because after short castle bishop c3, white is not obliged or forced to take on c3, which would give black a good position, and it is something that we are striving to transpose to, but not with this move order, because bishop b3 here is strong. And as we will see when in the other line, when black has already castled and bc3 has been played, black can play the move queen h5, but here queen h5 is not good because of the tactics bishop takes f7, king f7, knight g5, and black loses the queen. So after ed5, take on c3 with check, forcing white to take on c3, and only now take on d5. Now if white goes bishop b3, there is queen e4 check, so that's safe. And after castles, castle, bishop b3, yeah, we have the same thing, but with castles and bc3 played, queen h5 is safe to play. And now in view of the threat of bishop g4, putting pressure on that knight on f3, knight g5, queen d1, rook d1, knight a5, bishop c2. The endgame is fine for black, who can play in more than one way. He can play h6, knight e4, knight e7, rerouting the knight, controlling d5, controlling c4, intending bishop e6, and so forth. There is also f6, knight e4, bishop e6, developing the bishop, still controlling these light squares. Black's plays really simple, as he wants to control the light squares in front of the c3 and d4 pawns. And there is also, let's say, rook e8, f3, b6, and then bishop b7. This was played in the online game Sashikiran Demchenko this year, a game that black actually won. So remember the details about the move order. After e5, take on c3 with check, yeah, and force white to recapture. Similarly, after short castle, now there is no check on c3, so don't take on c3, because it's not a check, because then e d5, queen d5, bishop b3, we have transposed into the bad line that that black wants to avoid. Again, to remind you, queen h5 would be what black would like to play, but bishop f7, king f7, knight g5 is problematic. And putting the queen on f5 after bc3, short castle, rook e1 is suboptimal for black, because the queen is blocking the development of the bishop, and white has quite dangerous initiative here. So after short castle, it's not a check on c3, so then don't take on e4. And after knight e4, castle now. Yeah. And now we have extra pair of light pieces, bishop on b4 and knight on e4, and an IQP on d4. It's a complex position, but black's play is really simple. After d5, knight c7, because the setup he's aiming for is that the bishop will drop back to d6, the bishop will be developed on f5, and when white drops the bishop back from a4, because it's not doing anything there, to b3, yeah, let's say, black plays queen d7, connecting the rooks with a very good position. So to illustrate, yeah, let's say bishop b3, bishop f5, knight g3, bishop d6, rook e1, queen d7. This is the setup that black is aiming for. Very solid position, all the pieces are well placed. h6 is a useful move to make. f4 is well controlled, knight f4, bishop f4, rooks again come to the center, rook d8, rook e8, maybe bishop g4. Okay, many ideas to play with the pieces. Instead of bishop b3, a3 was played in the game by Shea Pragnananda, played in St. Louis this year. And here an improvement over Pragnananda's play would be just to go for the proposed setup with bishop d6, bishop b3, bishop f5, yeah? And then queen d7 next. It's just very straightforward, very simple setup for black. Just to show you, let's say rook e1, queen d7, let's say knight d6, queen d6, bishop e3, but now bishop e4. Yeah? Targeting that knight, but also attacking the pawn on d5. So no problems for black. So this is the second, let's say, critical line, which is knight c3, d5. The only thing to remember here is that to take on c3 when it's a check, and if white castles first, not to take because it's not a check, and take on e4 instead. Now let's move on to the second critical line, which is the move bishop d2. Yeah, and now black has a choice. Now black's choice depends on his preference. Now if black is fine playing a playable endgame, which visually looks a bit inferior, but in fact it's quite playable, then black can go for bishop takes d2, queen d2, knight bd2, d5 is just fine. So d5, e5, queen d5, knight c3, queen e6 check, queen e3, queen e3, fe3, bishop d7. So this is the endgame I was talking about. White has a freer play thanks to this pawn duo in the center, which gives him some space and free piece play, but that's also an extra pawn island. Yeah, and black is extremely solid, no weaknesses. He will castle long, play f6, put the rooks in the center, and just control these central pawns. So the endgame is playable, obviously, and it's just a matter of taste. Is black wants to play this endgame or not. So game can continue. Let's say short castle, f6, knight e4, long castle, knight c5, and now knight b8. An important move, seeking exchanges. Yeah. So let's say bishop c2, avoiding exchanges for the time being. Rook h e8, attacking the pawn on e3, rook f e1, and now black can just go get rid of the knight b6, take on d7, knight d7, rook c1, king b7, which is playable, or the engine's preference knight c6, intending knight b4, and knight d7, king d7, rook a d8, king c8. At the beginning, the engine is optimistic about white's chances, but if you let it run deeper depths, the advantage really decreases to some minimal advantage for white. Yeah, and it's not surprising because black is really solid. The pawns cannot really advance far, and it's hard for white to improve his position. So this is one option for black after bishop d2, to take on d2. Yeah, but if black wants to keep more dynamism in the position, then short castle is the move to play. Yeah, and now obviously the threat is to go d5 if allowed. So white should play d5 because let's say castling is just harmless. Take on d2 and push d5. Yeah, taking on b4 is also harmless. Bishop b4, knight b4, a3, knight c6, knight c3. Let's say if d5, b5, bishop c2, knight c5, again, no problem. d6 is coming, bishop g4, and so forth. So knight c3, d6. Already there is a threat, bishop g4. Yeah, and then knight h4. That knight is awkwardly pinned, so h3 should be played. And now the engine likes the move f5, which it says it's a great move. And I'm sure it is, but there are simpler ways to play. One is knight f4. Let's say targeting that pawn, and if g3 the knight drops back, oops, sorry, knight f4, if g3 knight goes back, and now the pawn on h3 is weakened, and f5 can come in a better version because the knight on f3 lacks the pawn support from the pawn on g2. And if short castle, queen f6, and already there are some threats on the king side, something like this. Yeah, and there is also the way to play in the center, knight ce7, bishop b3, and d5. Yeah, again, easy equality. The point is that if white takes on d5, there is also always knight f4 hitting g2 and hitting d5 and regaining the pawn. So that's why bishop b4 is harmless, as is short castle, thanks to the exchange on d2 and d5. So d5 for white is the only move. Now bishop takes d2, queen takes d2. Yeah, if knight d2, knight c5 still. Knight c5, knight e5, knight e5, short castle, b5, bishop b3. And now the precise move that black needs to remember in this position that gives him good play, and that is the move a5. Two ideas behind it. One is to develop the bishop to a6, okay, and the other one is to go a4 to hit the bishop, and when the bishop moves, the knight can land on c4. And this move ensures that black has equal play. So let's say f4, a4. This is the key. Yeah, bishop c2, knight c4, attacking the queen. Queen d4 or queen f2. Let's say queen f2, c6, undermining the center. Knight c3, take on d5, knight d5, bishop b7. Yeah, and that knight can be eliminated, and with an active knight and good play, rook e8 in the center, rook c8. Yeah, black has a good game. Or in case of queen d4, queen f6 is a good move. Yeah, exchanging queens, because queen f6, gf6, it's a good endgame for black. Rook e8 can target that pawn on e4. Knight is targeting the pawn on b2. d6 will be played, so problem-free endgame for black. And in case of something like e5, queen b6 will make sure that the queens will be exchanged, and without queens, that overextended pawn center will really mean very little. And that's it. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. You see this modern line, knight g7 in the Ruy Lopez, seems to be, it's not without reason that it's popular with the elite players, and as you can see, it's very simple to learn and play. Very few lines to learn and remember, and very simple and straightforward play for black. And I think it's just a great addition to your repertoire, or even basing your repertoire on this line would be just great. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Cowboy Hikaru says, smash that subscribe button. Yeah, leave your feedback in the comments. If you leave your feedback by email, follow my Substack, tag me on Twitter, whatever. stay in touch and let me know what you think. So guys, thanks for watching. I hope you liked this new developments, and I'll see you again pretty soon. Take care.